All right, so with this PowerPoint little mini lecture here, we're going to be talking about the rhetorical situation. Now, this is basically the foundation for the way in which we will consider reading and writing in this class. As you'll see as we go through this, it basically gives you the ideas that a writer, or what I'll start referring to as a rhetor, which encompasses, speakers or writers, basically people who form and deliver arguments. These are the things that they consider. This is kind of the background work. This is kind of the foundation, or things that you don't necessarily see when an argument is being delivered, but these are the ideas that are considered and thought of. It's almost like the homework before the test. So we're going to be talking about argument and rhetoric, and from a macro or kind of a large scale issue, and then as these videos continue, we'll start narrowing it down to the choices of language and syntax and things like that. But that's for another video. Today we're going to be talking about argument and rhetoric. Now, these two terms are usually used sometimes as synonyms, but they're not quite synonymous. They are closely related. One does inform the other. So starting with the connection between these two, I want to make sure we have a definition for argument and rhetoric, so we know exactly what we're talking about here. The term of argument, how we will use it in this class when we are thinking about it, whether we are reading or writing, is that an argument is an author's version of truth based on reasons and evidence. So basically that's the idea that anything or everything can be considered an argument. It is your version or that author's or that writer's version of truth. And they use reasons and evidence to support it and back it up. Rhetoric comes in here, and again you can see that this is the oldest field of study, or the oldest discipline in the Western civilization. Again, you can see it's been around since 4th century BCE. It was developed or defined by a Greek philosopher named Aristotle. And definitions of rhetoric have evolved with time. And I'm going to give you two definitions here, what I consider the classic definition from Aristotle, but also a contemporary definition, so you can make these distinctions, or you can really think about how rhetoric and argument work together. So with the classic definition, Aristotle defines rhetoric as identifying the available means of persuasion in any given situation. So that really does kind of put us in this place where rhetoric is situational or context dependent. The way a speaker or a writer or a rhetor will try to persuade one audience in one given situation, that can dramatically shift depending on any change in audience purpose, or some of these other terms we'll talk to. An example that I usually like to think about is me as a teacher. When I address a class full of seniors, that's a different situation than if I'm addressing an audience full of freshmen. There are different available means to me as a speaker in which I try to persuade or convince them or ask them to do an activity or a homework assignment, or other ideas like that. So that's one way to think about it, how depending on a given situation, there are different choices that the rhetor or the writer or the speaker can make in order to persuade that specific audience. So the contemporary definition kind of takes that idea and puts it in more easy to understand terms, which is, again, it's the choices of a rhetor that they make in communicating his or her version of truth to a specific audience. The key thing, or the key idea that I want you to take away with the idea of what rhetoric is that its essence, it's a study of the interplay between rhetor and the audience. That is what is always, I think, at the forefront or the foundation of what rhetoric is. It's exploring how a rhetor makes choices to suit a specific audience. And again, there are other aspects of this as well, but if you take one thing away from this, what rhetoric is, relationship, or the interplay between that speaker and that audience. So that leads us to the rhetorical situation. You're probably going to get really tired of hearing this term in this class, because when you ask me a question about writing, I'll usually tell you, consider this rhetorical situation. That will be my kind of standard go-to answer, because these are the things that, whether you're doing this professionally or in school or anything, these are the things that you need to consider before writing any piece. It's what professionals do, and that's what I'm going to be asking you to do as well. So the rhetorical situation is a global construct that guides the writer's choices in inventing, arranging, crafting, and delivering an argument. They do not start writers do not start arranging and writing and thinking about how to present these arguments without having considered the rhetorical situation first. Having a good understanding, a solid understanding, a clear understanding of these elements of the rhetorical situation basically makes for the best type of writing, because again, your choices that you will make will go back to things such as who you are as a speaker, who your audience is, what your topic or subject is, what the context is, and what the purpose is of your argument. So that's why we're going to break this down and look at each element of the rhetorical situation in its own little place. And this is when we come to this idea of the rhetorical triangle. You're going to see a lot of elements of the rhetorical triangle here in these videos. So we're starting the first one here with the rhetorical situation. Before we even get into the triangle, we have to think of this idea of context, exigence, or occasion. I will use these terms interchangeably. They all deal with the same basic idea about arguments and rhetoric. And the thing you need to know is that arguments are created and read in complicated environments. The idea is that arguments do not exist in a vacuum. It's not like one day, Abraham Lincoln woke up and said, "You know what? I feel like I need to write a speech about the war." For example, the Gettysburg Address. Obviously, the Battle of Gettysburg in the Civil War was a horrendous battle. Many people were killed, and he needed to write an address or a speech in response to what had just happened. So these environments are always shifting. There's all these different little things going on, these little nuances that writers or readers need to be cognizant of or aware of, and that can come from cultural context, economic context, all these different things that can inform and develop an argument. So as we read and we write arguments in this class, you need to consider the context that surround the argument. So again, the visual that I'll give you is this big circle, and then the argument will fit into this circle right about here. But for right now, the context or the exigence or the occasion basically ask you to think about what outside factors do we need to know before reading or writing an argument. What is going on in the world or the time, in the writer's life or something like that? This all falls into the issue of context. So that's starting with that kind of larger global kind of look at it. What's going on that forces this argument to come into existence? It's not like something that just pops into a person's head. Something has happened. The writer or the reader feels the need to respond to that event. So that is what context is all about. And now here's where our triangle starts to come in too. When you see the finished or completed rhetorical situation, you'll see this triangle placed within the circle of context. But for right now, we're going to the first part of the triangle, which deals with the subject or topic. And again, I will use these terms interchangeably. But basically, what subject is the writer addressing? What facts or other information are presented about this subject? I gave you the example of Abraham Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address when he's, obviously the topic that he's addressing deals with that battle, but it's also dealing with the Civil War. Presents information like that. Every speech has some type of topic or subject that the writer or the reader will be addressing. And what information do they bring in is an important thing to consider in the speech and the construction of that speech or writing or whatever text you're looking at. Leads us to the next part. And like I've said, you've probably heard me use these terms interchangeably already. Reader, speaker, or writer. Basically the person who is constructing the argument or the text. And the thing that we need to think about with the reader is how does the reader establish credibility or authority on the topic? We'll get into this a little bit in more detail when we start talking about rhetorical appeals. But when you think about the reader, it's basically who is the person speaking or writing or delivering this argument. And the other nuance or the other part of this as well is not only establishing credibility or authority on the topic, it's basically how does a writer develop connections with the audience. We'll talk more about this in a later video, but that is a really important question to think about, and that also leads very closely into the next element of the triangle, which deals with the audience or readers or listeners, however you want to think about it, but basically the person receiving the message. Now, this is what's crucial between speaker and audience. Like I said with rhetoric, it is that study of the interplay between speaker and audience, or writer and reader, rhetor and listeners. All those terms, again, I'm using interchangeably. But it's the idea of what does the rhetor know about the audience's values and beliefs? How can the rhetor evoke the audience's emotions? And that's the key thing with the audience, because again, with the idea of rhetoric being the available means of persuasion, you want your audience or readers to do something. Maybe, if you're thinking about, an election, you want to move them to action to vote for you. So how will you do that? What emotional connection can you make with that audience? And again, if you're going into an audience or a situation where, the audience is maybe a little bit more hostile to your beliefs, how do you show them that you are one of them? How do you connect with them? So you can see the idea of audience and speaker and rhetor very closely linked. Those two ideas are going back and forth. Because if you can't make a good connection with that audience, chances of your argument being accepted is very, very limited. And then in the middle of the triangle, I have this empty line here, and that is for purpose or aim or intention. I'll usually try to use the word purpose, but those words, again, are interchangeable. Purpose is basically, what does the rhetor hope to achieve with the argument? What does the rhetor want the audience to do after hearing the argument? I gave you a few examples there about, a presidential candidate asking for your vote. Maybe it's a commercial asking you to buy their product. Maybe it's a salesman saying, you need to buy this car. This is really at the center of the rhetorical situation is, again, I want a specific audience to take some specific action. What means are available to me as a speaker to have this audience achieve this goal? So that's what purpose and aim is, and as you can see there, it's at the very center of the rhetorical situation. There's an acronym, SOAPS, that also deals with this as well. Again, I understand some people are more, remember things linguistically or deal more with language. Other people like the visual representation. So I'm going to give both of these to you because they do deal with the same basic idea. These are the things that we consider with the rhetorical situation. So you hear this thing called SOAPS, and you can see there what it stands for: speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, and subject. Those are the ideas that make up the rhetorical situation. So you can remember it as SOAPs, or you can remember it as the visual with the triangle and the circle. So to wrap up or to conclude the rhetorical situation, this is the foundation for a rhetor's choices when constructing and presenting his or her arguments. Whether you're writing something in this class, whether you're writing something in another class, whether 10, 15 years down the road you're writing something for, a business proposal, a loan request, or whatever, these are the things that you will consider before writing and delivering that argument. Other thing to make sure that you know is that the rhetorical situation is fluid. Each part of the situation inform and relate to one another. Now, we do break all these things down into their separate entities, but the thing to take away from this is to remember that they do inform one another. They are working with each other. They are not just these separate things, kind of that are not related to one another. They are very closely, connected. And then always consider these elements of the rhetorical situation when reading and writing in this class. When we start reading essays and I ask you to, think of the rhetorical situation, that's usually what I'm going to ask you to think about first. Because then when we start with this global, large-scale issues, you can start looking at and analyzing the more individual choices when it comes to how they structure the argument and how do they use specific choices of language, from word choice to sentence structure to imagery and figurative language. Then we can start really thinking about why do they make those choices and how do they affect the argument and the audience, going back to the larger issues of the rhetorical situation. So that's our first introduction here to the rhetorical situation. Starting over the next couple of days and into the weeks ahead, we will always be considering these ideas and we'll be practice, using these terms as we read and discuss arguments in this class.